People squint at me kind of funny when I talk about growing a winter garden in Michigan, but the truth is, these empty beds behind me could have a ton of different crops growing in them if I had just not gotten such a late start this year. And I thought I would talk through my tips for designing and laying out a winter garden that I will put in next year. And I'll go into this in more depth, but I'll start with just the short version of my 4 main tips. How much to plant? You're going to want to plant much more area than you think you're going to need. It's true for gardening in general, but it is super true for the winter garden, and I'll explain why. Thinking through what to plant. Don't only plant things that are going to survive your coldest temperatures. Instead, design this for a managed die-off over time. When to plant them? You're going to need to adjust your days of maturity for shortening day lengths, and where to plant them. Plan ahead to avoid conflicts with your spring plantings. First, how much to plant? You are going to need to plant a large winter garden relative to what you would put in, say, the spring for 2 reasons. The first is that plant growth slows down a lot as the days get shorter. I'll go into that much more in depth when we talk about the when to plant. But suffice it to say, unlike the normal garden where you can harvest things and it grows back, in the winter you're basically starting with a fixed inventory and you're drawing it down. The second one, and I learned this the hard way, is that in the fall and the winter, animals get hungry, and you're going to have a little more pressure on the garden than you would in the normal growing season. I definitely recommend growing a little extra in case, like me, you get a rabbit that gets in there and decimates part of your garden. Second, what to plant. I'm going to show a visual here of my temperature data here in Southeast Michigan. The blue solid line is our average temperature, meaning it's colder than this about half the time. And the bottom pale blue edge here would be the 10th percentile, meaning it's only colder than this about 10% of the time. You can pull your own data and decide how conservative that you want to be. I decided to use the line on here for the average perceived temperature. That's the dashed line, and it is the temperature factoring in wind chill. Because it was near the bottom of the graph, but it wasn't at the absolute lowest point, and I thought it was a pretty good one to use. If I focus for now on just that line and kind of shade out everything else, you can see that the lowest temperature for which I would be designing is around 5 degrees Fahrenheit or negative 15 degrees Celsius. That is pretty darn cold. I've laid out some cold hardy vegetables here from least to most resistant, and you can see that if I only chose plants that would survive at my lowest temperature, I really wouldn't be growing very much. But it doesn't get that cold for a really long time. I'm filming this in the middle of November, and today it got up to almost 60 degrees Fahrenheit. I would rather think of this as a garden of attrition, where I know that some of them have this pending death date, but I just make a point of harvesting those out before that happens. If I map out this path of death over time, you can see that in theory, I would lose my potatoes by early November, followed by bok choy and mustards in late November. Then I would lose arugula, radishes, peas, and spinach somewhere around early December. I could keep harvesting lettuce, carrots, beets, fava beans, and rutabagas, if I ever grow rutabagas, until mid-December, and would finally lose my cold hardiest crops like chard, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, kale, tatsoi, and mizuna by, say, the new year. There are a few crops like mash, leeks, and collard greens that should survive all winter, but I have lived here for a decade and I have seen us hit negative temperatures in the Fahrenheits multiple times. 2 pieces of good news as far as extending even more what I can grow and for how long. First, root crops can be left in the ground as long as you can keep it from freezing solid. With a thick enough mulch of something like fall leaves on top, that is possible even in our winters. Second, there are perennial crops that can survive in much colder winters than I am likely to see, and I can add those for some extra variety and as insurance in case we ever get a freakishly cold winter. Third, let's talk about when to plant things, because you cannot just go off of the days to maturity listed on your seed packets when you are planting a fall or winter garden. This is because of the impact of shortening day lengths. I've got a graph here of my day length, the light blue, over the course of the year. My night length is the darkest blue at the bottom, and then twilight and sunset are in between. Plants require 10 hours of daylight for active growth, and they go almost dormant when your days are shorter than that. Elliot Coleman coined the term the Persephone period to refer to this time of the year when things just really aren't growing. The further away you live from the equator, the sooner in the year this happens. In my case, I dropped to less than 10 hours in mid-November, and it stays that way until mid-February. The tricky part is that this isn't binary. It's not like things grow at a steady clip until the first day of your Persephone period. My plants begin growing again in February, and as we move on towards the summer solstice, their growth speeds up as the days get longer. As we pass the solstice and head towards mid-November, their growth slows down until we hit Persephone and it stops effectively completely. Most of the days to maturity listed on seed packets are based on a spring planting, meaning they believe you're planting it and then growing it through these extending day lengths. If you're planting things later in the year, it can take a lot longer for these same plants to mature. I wish there was some simple rule that I could give you for this, but the truth is, plants that have a longer growing period are much more affected by this than plants with shorter ones, so it really depends on the crop. Instead, I made this chart. I won't walk through all of this. Feel free to just screenshot it and look through it at your leisure, but I pulled this from a variety of sources over the years, and it works pretty well for where I live. If you live closer to the equator, you could get away with later plantings, and if you're further north than I am in Michigan, or the equivalent distance further south, if you live south of the equator, you might need to plant even sooner. Consider this as a helpful starting point, but your mileage may vary. Last, where to plant things. As you think about your winter garden, you need to be really thinking about next year's garden and making sure that you don't conflict with things. And you've also got to work this into your crop rotation plan. I follow the 10-year rotation plan shown here. Originally, I had only planned to use one bed, listed here as bed number 1, for winter crops, but as I mentioned at the beginning, I realized that I need to plant way more area. The question was, where could I work these in, and where should I not even try and do it? I'm showing the current layout of the beds, numbered by what is in them for this year, and then the rotation as it plays out next year. My goal is to plant anywhere that I can, so I went through and identified only the beds that can't be planted with late fall and winter crops. First, I leave the beds fallow for one of the 10 years, and nothing is getting planted in there. That one's marked out in red. Second, I do have one bed designated for early spring harvest. I'll go into this in more depth later, but as an example, I have carrots in here that are going to overwinter and come up next spring for an earlier harvest, assuming I can keep them under mulch. That lets me harvest them much sooner in the spring, but it means that they cannot handle anything else this winter. That's bed 7 in the plan for next year, so the bed that is currently bed 6 cannot be used over this winter. That's why it's marked as summer only. The last thing I have to think about is my garlic. Garlic's kind of an odd crop in that you plant it in the fall and then harvest it the following summer. I'm going to interplant mine with broccoli and then harvest it out the next year with the potatoes. That means I can't realistically use bed number 3 for growing winter crops, or at least not without the hassle of working around the garlic. That leaves me with 7 of my 10 beds that could be used to grow late fall and winter crops. The question is what to grow in each and how to group them together. Bed number 4 has potatoes in it. I will plan to mulch that and leave them in place for harvesting through the fall and winter until they're depleted. And beds 5 and 7 were already designated in my rotation for fall crops. They can hold some of those less cold hardy vegetables that I harvest out a little sooner. The other 4 beds require more thought. The central truth here is that even if your crops could survive to 10 or 15 degrees Fahrenheit, you are not going to want to spend a bunch of time outdoors harvesting when it is that cold. Consequently, I strongly recommend grouping these together by their expected die-off date so that you can completely ignore one entire bed when they all die, instead of walking around your garden harvesting just a little bit from all of these different beds. I landed on the groupings shown here. First, next to the potato bed, I will plan on putting in and then heavily mulching my other root crops like carrots and beets. In theory, I might be harvesting from these all winter, and they'll take some time to pull back the mulch and get to, so I chose the beds that were closest to my entrance along the north edge of the garden. At least this way I can minimize how far I have to walk to get to them. My second grouping I will call my November bed. This is comprised of the crops that will mostly die off by the end of November. That includes peas, and they need to be trellised and they need pollination, meaning there won't be a cover over this bed. Now, fava beans can survive longer, but since they also need pollination, I've put them in here in the November bed along with the peas. I've only used 2 of the beds for this particular group because they have some potential for repeat harvest through the fall, and I should get more of a yield. In contrast, I've used 3 full beds for my last group, the ones that will die by the end of December. These won't get as much chance to regrow, and as such, I want to dedicate plenty of space to them. This includes brassicas like kale, cabbage, and Brussels sprouts that would benefit from being grown under cover to fend off cabbage moths, so I've made sure that this bed doesn't include anything that needs pollination. Last, I've shown a quick layout here of what these beds would look like in my particular layout. These beds are a little under 23 feet long and a little over 7 feet wide. For the root crops, I've grouped the carrots in a big block down the middle and placed the beets at the edges. That makes it easier to find them once their tops are all gone and I'm digging around under mulch. The November bed has the pea trellis placed along its north edge to avoid casting too much shade on the other plants. The low angle of sun in fall and winter makes that a real consideration. Last, for the covered bed, I've placed the tallest crops down the middle and the shorter ones along the edges to make it easier to tuck them under my arched row covers and accommodate things like Brussels sprouts at the tallest point. If you're thinking, but Rachel, won't this screw up your entire carefully thought out 10-year rotation plan? The answer is not really. The color coding on these layouts shows the plant families, and you can see that they have a mix of different types. If anything, I may have too many things in the brassica family, the pale green. Brassicas are heavy feeders, and I'll need to keep an eye on the nitrogen levels in my soil, but I tend to do that anyway when I think about adding compost or things like blood meal into the planting holes. I think that one I can manage. I know that one was dense. I hope it's helpful. I wanted to walk through the logic and the way that I approach the problem as opposed to giving you some kind of cookie cutter template. Let me know if you have questions. I will happily answer them. And I will get into the topics like overwintering in my subsequent videos. Until next time, I hope that was helpful. Thanks.